Today, October the 24th, 1972, we are interviewing Mrs. Lee, F-L-O-Y-D, Mrs. Lee Floyd, from Waynoka, Oklahoma. This interview is taken by James Katigan from the city of Alva, Oklahoma. Mrs. Floyd, let's open up this interview by getting some of your background. Tell us something about where you were born and something about the different members of your family here to start off with.
Okay. Well, my parents were the K.H. Kendalls, and they made the run in the Cherokee Strip, and the Cherokee Strip was open for settlement. My father came on the train from Kaiwa, and Mother drove a wagon, and also my oldest brother, who was 7 years old at the time, drove a wagon. And out on the prairie, some place between here and Kaiwa, a wheel went off of my mother's wagon, and she was stranded out there for quite a while because no one wanted to stop. They were all in such a hurry to get here to file on a claim or file on some lots that finally a horseman came along and he stopped and fixed the wheel, and she came on in. And my father filed on the lots across from the Bell Hotel here in Alva, where the Chevy garage is and a filling station on the corner. And they had a bakery on that lot. They had the first bakery in Alva, and they also had the first cow, and they gave the milk away to mothers with young children. And I think they lived in Alva probably until about about 1901, I believe. And they moved to Augusta, and it's a little town that's been done away with. And it was a mile and a half west of Carmen, and he operated a general store there. And of course they went through the hardships of all the pioneers, but they made many friends that they kept through life because most of them didn't move too far away. I was born in Augusta. When my folks came to Alva, there was 3 children in the family: Carl Kendall, L.P. Kendall, and Eva W. Kendall. And Eva, she was the oldest girl. She lives in Alva now and is 81 years old. And there is then 3 of us was born in Augusta: Hope Kendall, who has passed away, and Lorene Morgan, who lives in Houston, and myself. I live in Waynoka. After the railroad went through Carmen instead of Augusta, everybody moved from Augusta to Carmen. But my father had the pioneer spirit, and he moved to the Galena community, which is 25 miles south of Alva, just north of the old 21 crossing on the Cimarron River. In the early day, the 21 crossing, as it was called, was a landmark. Everybody told directions from the 21 crossing. And here at Galena, again, he run a general store, and it was said that he sold everything from patent leather shoes to log chains. And they tell about when I was a youngster, they got in a new log chain and it was laying on the floor in the store, and I had a great sense of smell. And I didn't know what it was, so I got down and smelt of it to find out what this log chain was. In those days, everybody went in wagons, buggies, or on horseback. It was the only way of travel they had. And people came from all around to trade at the store because they never came to Alva around. And my father had a man that he called the freighter, and he made at least one trip a week to Alva to buy the groceries and all the stuff we had in the store. And I remember there used to be drummers came to the store. Of course, they're called salesmen now. In those days, they were drummers, and I can remember them opening their suitcases with their different things in it, you know. And what fascinated me most was the shoes. I always wanted them. And in the store, we had a little pair of patent leather shoes with some blue beads on them. And my sister and I, we would try them on every day to see if our feet was big enough for them, but I don't think we ever did get them because they were always too big for us. And when people came to the store, why, they would come in wagons and they would have their hay in the back of the wagon for their horses. And they would unhitch the horses and tie them to the back of the wagon, and the horses would eat while they were in the store trading. And if they were there at noon, they'd buy them a lunch of cheese and crackers and sardines, and they would eat their lunch there. And my sister Hope, my folks used to say, always stood around and watched everybody that ate, and they'd give her something to eat, and that was a joke we always had on her. The people were all poor, but they were honest, and my father sold much of the stuff on time, and one old man used to always say, bought it on tick instead of on time. There was a lot of fascinating families that lived down there that we have known all our lives. There was the families of Marion English, better known as Jack English. R.S. Armour and his son Bob Armour lives on the ranch that he proved up in the early day. Ed Kretziner, the Sandman family, Foss Rose family, and in 1906, I think it was, Coon Floyd moved down into the Galena community. The English family moved from Pratt, Kansas, and Mr. English built a log cabin and stayed there for some time before Mrs. English and the children moved down. One night, a lone horseman rode up and asked to stay all night. Travelers were never turned away, and in the early day, so he was given his supper and bed and breakfast, and on leaving, he thanked Mr. English and told him that he was Black the Outlaw. But he had been very courteous to Mr. English all the time he was there. And Mr. Armour told many tales of the pioneer days. One day he had ridden north looking for stray cattle. He had gotten a drink at the UP Spring. Now this spring is on the ranch that my husband and I own today. And it has always flown the same amount of water in drought or wet times. And you can stick your arm down in this spring and pull up porous rocks, and you can clean it all out as far as you can reach down, and the next day you can do the same thing. We always said, I guess those rocks came from China. Mr. Armour had gotten a drink at the spring and had walked over to a little hill that had some trees on it to sit down to rest himself, when another man came up and got him a drink. And Mr. Armour said he just sat there, but pretty soon the man came over and asked him his name and where he lived, and he told him, and he said, well, you just better get going back down the valley and go home. And Mr. Armour said this was either Yeager or Black, the outlaw, one of the outlaws, and I can't remember which he said it was. Then Mr. Armour tells of a government agent that was taking money to the Indians across the river, and when he got to the 21 crossing, he became alarmed that he was being followed, and he buried the money somewhere down there. And Mr. Armour said he never did dig a post hole that he didn't think of, surely he would hit that money. But the only thing he ever found was a box of scissors and knives and implements to sharpen them when, and he thought that some peddler probably had been crossing the river farther up when it was up and had lost them. Ed Kretziner was a hunter and trapper. And in those days, quail was abundant in the southern part of our county, and it was against the law, but the law kind of shut its eyes, I guess, because Mr. Kretzner used to buy quail and hunt quail, and he would take a load of quail to Enid, and as he'd had the bottom of his wagon full of quail covered with a tarpaulin, and he'd come by the store and borrow some money from my father to go to Enid to sell his quail, and then when he came back, he would pay him back. And he said that my father had the most unique bank he ever saw. Said K.H. would go to the back of his store, and there was a pile of empty cans, and go out and select a can, and there would be his money. But one of the highlights in my life when I was a youngster was a merry-go-round that my father owned. It was hauled in wagons because there wasn't any trains, and of course it was really hard to haul this merry-go-round because the roads were so sandy and the wheels of the wagons cut down so bad in the sand, and he didn't keep it too long. And Foss Rose and his brother Jim Rose were managers, or you kept the engines running, and my brother L.P. Kendall and sister Eva Kendall, of course they were in their teens, helped with it, and there was Belle Rose and Ethel Rose, and the girls sold tickets and took up tickets. They had a lark running the merry-go-round and have talked about it all their lives. The main source of entertainment in those days was a literary held at the different schoolhouses. Everybody took part. They gave readings, or I should say pieces. They called speaking a piece in those days. They sang or had dialogues, and at Christmas there was a big tree for everybody. In our district, Mr. Armour was always Sandy because he was jolly and fat. The schoolhouse in our district was down quite a ways in the hills, and the children had to walk about 1.5 miles to school, but they had fun walking down there and they didn't mind it. And they tell that one time they had a teacher named Mr. West, and at noon the seats weren't fastened down, and they would pull them all back and they'd dance, have square dances. There was no doctors, and my mother, Mrs. Kendall, went far and near to help care for the sick. Her main medicine was whiskey. When you had a stomach ache, it was a hot toddy. When you had a headache, it was a hot toddy. And she used to say that whenever she got a new bottle of her medicine, Mr. English got awfully sick. Jenny Montfort, who everyone in Alva probably will remember that were here in the early day, she was a sister to Bill and John Montfort, and later was principal of the East Side School here in Alva. Jenny took a claim across the river, and she would come by the store driving a team of burros hitched to a little spring wagon and go over to her claim for 2 or 3 days and then back to Alva. At this time, Marion Montfort, her nephew, has 2 or 3 gas wells on the land, and you could say that it went from burros to gas wells. In our childhood, we heard of Carrie Nation. She was a good friend of a lady, Mrs. Martin, who lived close by. Coon Floyd bought the farm from Mrs. Martin, and before she left, she lived in a small house in the Floyd yard. Carrie Nation came to visit her. One evening, they were in the Floyd home visiting, and as she was talking, her false teeth fell out. It scared the children, as they had never seen teeth that came out. So she passed them around so they could see them and hold them. The blacksmith shop was an early day must. One was run by John Mallory in the yard of the general store. He shoed horses, fixed wagons, wheels, and so forth. Of course, there was some horse racing on Saturday afternoon. Everyone had the best horse, and I expect there was a little betting if anyone had any money. Times were hard, no one had any money, but people were happy and friendly. Everyone worked hard, even if there was a house full of children. Grandma and Grandpa had a home with their sons and daughters.
Mrs. Floyd, tell us something about your parents when they arrived in Oklahoma and where they came from. Also, give us a little history about your husband and his people that came to Oklahoma also.
My parents came to Kansas soon after they were married, and I don't know just when that was, the dates, and they lived around Coldwater for a few years, and then, as I said, they made the run in the Cherokee Strip. My father was born in Ohio and mother in Indiana, and they were always true pioneers. As soon as they got married, they came out west. My husband's father was Coon Floyd, and he left Alabama when he was 16. He ran off, he and a brother and a friend, and came to Oklahoma. That was before the opening of the Strip, and they wanted to be cowboys. Well, their folks came after them and took him home, and then Coon later ran off by himself and came to Oklahoma and was a cowboy, and they let him stay. And he filed on a claim around Hennessy, Oklahoma, but he didn't stay there too long. He just was just more of a cowboy and worked for different ranches and different cow outfits. Coon never lost his southern hospitality. He was a true southerner. He talked with a southern accent, and much to the disappointment of his wife, none of the children had this accent. But Coon always said corn and hoss, and we always got such a kick out of him. He was a wonderful man. He was true to his friends and to his children, and whenever you'd go to his home, no matter how old he got, he'd always kiss you and say, "Hello there, sweetheart." And of course we all loved that. And my husband at this time has a ranch that Mr. Floyd owned in the Galena community. But we have retired and live in Waynoka at the present time, have been retired for about 20 years. At the present, my husband's health is poor, and so we don't do much. We have one son, Gerald Floyd, who lives in Ponca City and is a patent attorney for the Continental Oil Company in Ponca City.
Mrs. Floyd, tell us something about your recollection of the early days in Alva. For instance, your schooling and your church work and some of the civic duties that we'd call them now. And do you remember some of the experiences about your schooling in Alva in these days?
Well, I started to school in Alva when I was in the 4th grade. We lived 25 miles south of here, and I had some older sisters that were ready for high school, and so my father just rented a house up here on 4th Street, and we lived there and went to school. My mother would come up sometimes and stay 2 or 3 weeks with us, but she was needed on the farm, so she would go back. My sister Eva, my oldest sister, she didn't go to school. She worked at the Central National Bank and in the treasurer's office at the courthouse for years. My sister Hope graduated from the college. It was called the normal school then up here, and my sister Lorene went to high school up here and college. I graduated from high school and then went to 2 years of college, and then I got married and married Lee Floyd, whose home was about a quarter of a mile from ours down in the Galena community, and we had been sweethearts all our lives. And so we stayed there until after we were married. We lived on the farm down there in the Galena community until 1946, when we moved to moved to Waynoka, and Lee operated his ranch from there for 20 years, and then he retired. When I was living here in Alva, I joined the Methodist Church in Alva, later having my membership moved to the Waynoka Church after we moved to Waynoka. And in Waynoka, I belong to the Eastern Stars and am active in the Women's Society in the church, having been president of the society 2 different times. We have one son, Gerald Floyd, of whom we are very proud. He is a graduate of OU, and then after he graduated from OU, he went to night school, a law school, and he is at present a patent attorney for the Continental Oil Company in Ponca City.
Mrs. Floyd, as a comparison, what does you think are, in looking back on the early days up here in Alva and Woods County, what do you see as a future in the livelihood for the family here?
Well, of course, I think Woods County is the best place to live that ever was, because I've lived in it all my life. And it's hard to compare it, because in the early days people were so poor and hard up, and now we have about everything we want, and people are prosperous, and the farms are producing because they are fertilizing the land, that they get so much more wheat, better crops, and the cattle feed so much better than it used to be, and the men on the ranches, they don't just feed cattle the commercial feed in the winter, but they also feed in commercial feed in the summertime, keep out blocks and different feeds for them, and the cattle are really fat. And we were down to our ranch Sunday, and Virgil McBride of the Galena community leases it from us, and we were just noticing his cattle, how beautiful they look down on the ranch Sunday. And we have just had an oil well drilled down on the ranch, and they've just completed it, and they're testing, but much to our sorrow, I think it's going to be a dry hole, but we've lived without it this long. We can for a while longer, but of course they go back in these holes and open them up a lot of times. But everybody, I think, is prosperous, and that's about all I have to say about it.
We have just completed a delightful interview with Mrs. Lee Floyd of Waynoka, Oklahoma, from the city of Alva, Oklahoma, for the Oklahoma Living Legends, the Oklahoma Christian College, and the Historical Society of the state of Oklahoma. Your interviewer today has been James Katigan on October the 24th, 1972.